There's a place in southern Egypt where the rock itself seems to remember something we haven't fully translated yet. Walk along the quarry walls at Aswan and run your hand across the stone, and you'll feel rows of shallow curved scoops, smooth to the touch, repeating in overlapping arcs like ripples frozen in granite. For more than a century, archaeologists have looked at these marks and offered a tidy explanation. But new digital tools are starting to complicate the tidy story, and what they're revealing is far more interesting than a simple mystery solved. Let's set the scene. Aswan sits on the banks of the Nile in southern Egypt, far south of Cairo, in a region that supplied granite for some of the most iconic monuments in Egyptian history. Temples, statues, towering obelisks, elements of the pyramids themselves. Much of it traces back to stone hauled out of these quarries. Granite is not an easy material to work with. It ranks between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, tougher than most of the metal tools available to ancient workers. Cutting it, shaping it, and moving it across the desert would have demanded enormous coordinated effort, no matter what methods were used. That alone deserves more respect than it usually gets. The centerpiece of the site is the unfinished obelisk, a single massive block still attached to the bedrock, abandoned after cracks appeared partway through the carving process. Had it been completed, it would have weighed close to 1,000 tons, making it one of the largest single pieces of stone ever attempted by human hands in the ancient world. Around this obelisk run deep trenches, and it's the walls of those trenches that carry the strange scoop marks that have puzzled researchers for generations. Each scoop measures roughly 6 to 8 inches across and 2 to 4 inches deep, curving in smooth, repeating arcs that stack into a rippled, almost wave-like texture. They don't feel jagged or fractured the way you'd expect from stone struck over and over with another rock. That unexpected smoothness is exactly what has kept the mystery alive for so long. The standard explanation has been around for decades. Workers supposedly used handheld balls of dolerite, a stone harder than granite, pounding the surface again and again until fragments broke away. It's a reasonable theory, and it's not just armchair speculation. Archaeologists have actually tested it in the field, recreating the pounding technique to see what results it produces. That's where things get complicated. When researchers replicate the dolerite pounding method under controlled conditions, the marks that come out don't quite match what's carved into the walls at Aswan. Hand pounding tends to create rough, irregular pits. Edges fracture unevenly. Depth varies from strike to strike because no human arm delivers exactly the same force swing after swing, hour after hour. The scoops at Aswan, by contrast, show remarkably little variation across large stretches of wall. People have noticed this discrepancy for years, but without a precise way to measure it across an entire quarry face, it stayed more of a passing observation than a documented anomaly. This is where three-dimensional scanning changes the equation. Over the last several years, teams working in Egypt have turned to laser scanning and photogrammetry, a process that stitches together thousands of overlapping photographs into an exact digital model of a surface, to document these quarry walls in far greater detail than a tape measure in a notebook ever allowed. Instead of eyeballing a wall and guessing, researchers can now capture the precise geometry of every scoop, its curve, its depth, the angle it was cut at, recorded down to fractions of a millimeter, and preserved digitally so it can be studied endlessly without touching the original stone. Once that kind of data set exists, it opens the door to AI-assisted pattern analysis. This isn't a system inventing conclusions out of thin air. It's a tool built to process massive volumes of measurements faster and more consistently than any person manually comparing marks with a ruler. Feed thousands of scanned scoops into software designed for statistical pattern recognition, and it can flag things a human eye would likely miss while walking the site. Unexpected uniformity, repeating spacing intervals, geometric consistency spread across dozens of meters of wall. And that's exactly what has caught researchers' attention. Early digital surveys of parts of the Aswan trenches suggest that many of these scoop marks are more consistent in size and spacing than random hand tool percussion would typically generate. Not machine tolerance perfect, but consistent enough to raise legitimate questions about how much of this work was pure freehand pounding, and how much may have relied on some kind of guide or repeated technique that hasn't been identified yet. Perhaps a wooden or stone jig that steadied the swing, or a method refined and passed down through generations of specialized quarry workers until it became a kind of practiced muscle memory that short-term modern experiments haven't managed to reproduce. It's worth being precise about what this does and doesn't suggest. It does not mean the marks were made by lasers, drills, or any form of powered machinery. No trace of ancient electricity, no diamond-tip tooling, nothing resembling modern cutting technology has ever turned up in Egypt, and no credible scan or analysis claims otherwise. What it does suggest is that the old, simplified story, workers pounded randomly until stone broke away, might be a missing part of the picture. There may have been more method, more skill, and more consistency in ancient Egyptian stonework than that simplified version gives credit for. Now, consider the deep test pits, because these are just as strange and just as poorly explained by the traditional account. Scattered through the quarry complex are narrow vertical shafts cut straight down into solid granite, some reaching 30 to 50 feet deep while measuring only 3 to 4 feet across. The conventional explanation is that these were exploratory pits, dug to check the quality of stone below the surface before committing to a major extraction project. That's a reasonable idea. Quarry workers everywhere want to know if they're about to invest months of labor into rock riddled with hidden cracks. But picture actually digging one of these by hand, and the practical problems stack up quickly. Imagine standing 40 feet down a shaft only 3 feet wide. There's barely room to swing a hammer with any real force. Dust fills the air with nowhere to go. Light is minimal, meaning someone has to constantly manage torches or oil lamps in a cramped, poorly ventilated space far below ground. And every basket of broken rock has to be hauled up the entire depth of the shaft, over and over, a slow and exhausting logistical chain in itself. Recent 3D mapping of several of these pits adds another wrinkle. In a number of cases, the shafts don't run in a perfectly straight vertical line. They curve slightly as they descend, tracking natural mineral veins or weaknesses inside the granite that aren't visible from the surface. That detail suggests the people cutting these shafts had some way of anticipating what was happening inside the rock, whether through generations of hard-earned experience reading subtle surface clues, or some testing method that hasn't survived in the archaeological record. Either way, it points to a level of practical geological awareness rarely mentioned in the simplified version of ancient quarry work. There's also the question of wall quality. In a hand-dug shaft, you'd expect the workmanship to get rougher the deeper it goes, since conditions worsen the further down you travel. Less light, less air, more fatigue, less control. But scans of several Aswan test pits show wall quality that stays fairly consistent from top to bottom. It's a small, easy-to-miss detail, and exactly the kind of thing digital scanning is good at catching that a quick site visit would overlook. None of this proves hidden advanced technology was involved, but it does mean the quick pit dug in an afternoon explanation doesn't fully capture what's preserved in the stone. Then there's the depression in the southern part of the quarry complex, long identified as an ancient harbor or loading zone, where finished blocks were moved toward the Nile for transport downriver. Some researchers, who've studied its shape and volume using digital terrain models, have proposed a different reading, that its dimensions look less like a harbor and more like the empty cavity left behind after a single enormous block of stone was cut and removed in one piece. If that interpretation holds up, we're talking about a block that could have weighed several thousand tons, dwarfing anything Egypt is confirmed to have quarried and moved elsewhere. This idea remains genuinely debated and unsettled. The harbor explanation is still the mainstream view, but it's a legitimate open question that better survey data and geological modeling may eventually help resolve. Now for one of the most discussed pieces of evidence at the site, the red ochre paintings. In several spots throughout the Aswan quarries, simple reddish images of birds, boats, and geometric shapes appear on the granite, painted in a style closely resembling prehistoric rock art found elsewhere across the Sahara and the wider Nile Valley, a style generally associated with a period thousands of years before the first pharaohs. Here's the detail that has sparked so much discussion. In at least a few documented locations, this paint appears to sit inside the grooves of the scoop marks, meaning the scoop had to be cut before the paint was applied. If that layering holds up under closer examination, it raises a genuinely fascinating timeline question, suggesting some of this stone-cutting work may predate the paintings themselves, and by extension may be older than the dynastic period, usually credited with most of the quarry's work. It's important to stay careful here. Dating rock art precisely is difficult. Style alone isn't a reliable method for pinning down an exact age, and the paint-over-scoop relationship hasn't been confirmed consistently across the whole site, only in specific documented spots. Some archaeologists think these could be later additions layered onto older cut marks for symbolic or ritual reasons. Others believe the pattern deserves serious, dedicated dating work using modern chemical and stratigraphic methods, since a confirmed pattern like this would meaningfully challenge the standard timeline. Right now, it remains an open, actively contested question, not a settled fact. So where does this actually leave us? We have scoop marks that turn out to be more geometrically consistent, once properly measured, than basic pounding experiments have managed to reproduce. We have deep test pits showing a level of planning and structural awareness that's hard to explain with a quick, rough digging process. We have a depression whose true shape might represent the largest single stone extraction ever attempted in the ancient world, or might simply be an old harbor, depending on which model of the site you trust. And we have prehistoric-style paintings that, in some documented places, appear to sit directly on top of cutting marks whose true age isn't fully settled. None of this proves the existence of lost advanced technology. It's not evidence of some mythical civilization armed with power tools centuries ahead of their time. What it is a genuine, ongoing scientific puzzle, one that's finally coming into sharper focus, now that researchers have tools capable of measuring it with real precision. For over 100 years, people studied these marks mostly by eye, with rough field sketches and black and white photographs. Now, with high-resolution 3D scanning capturing every curve and every millimeter of depth across entire quarry walls, and AI-assisted analysis processing that data at a scale no individual researcher could manage in a lifetime, patterns that were always there are finally becoming visible. It isn't that ancient Egyptians secretly possessed hidden machinery. It's that our tools for studying their work have finally started catching up to the actual complexity of what they built by hand. The dolerite pounding explanation isn't necessarily wrong at its core, but it may be incomplete. Maybe there were guiding techniques or specialized tools that haven't survived in the archaeological record. Maybe generations of skilled quarry specialists developed a level of practiced precision that short-term modern experiments simply haven't matched. And maybe some marks really do belong to an earlier period than commonly assumed, in which case the paint layering evidence deserves rigorous, well-funded dating work rather than being dismissed outright, or oversold as proof of something far more sensational.